In this final part of the uh, topic countable and uncountable sets, we will be discussing a few more results, slightly more sophisticated in nature. So the first result is that R is equipotent with -1, 1 open interval. We have already seen that R is an uncountable set as well as the open interval -1 to 1 is an uncountable set. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be equipotent. We have not given any such argument, and in fact, this is not true, as we will see by the end of this lecture. So, we just see how this can be proved. And the proof which we are going to give here is actually describe a bijective mapping from the open interval -1, 1 to the set of real numbers. So the definition is that given any x between -1 and 1, you define fx to be equal to x divided by 1 minus x squared. So first of all, notice that since x is between -1 and 1, so the denominator 1 minus x squared is always a positive real number. Therefore, fx is well defined. Also, f0 is 0 is clear from here, and the sign of fx is going to depend on the numerator, sign of the numerator x. So therefore, any real number between 0 and 1 will map to a positive real number. So we say that it maps to the positive real axis, as which can be observed from here. And similarly, any real number between -1 and 0, so that would be a negative number, will map to the negative real axis. That is, fx would be a negative number. So this observation tells you that if you take a take 0 and take a non-zero real number, then they will not map to the same number under the map f. Not only that, if you take a positive real number and a negative real number, then they will not map to the same element of R under the map f, because positive maps to positive, negative maps to negative. So therefore, there is no question of they mapping to the same element. So we are trying to show that f is injective. Of that, we have shown these three cases. The only one left out is if we take two positive numbers, then what happens to their images? Or if we take two negative numbers in the domain, then what happens to its images? So suppose we take any two positive number x and y, or any two positive number negative number x and y, then obviously x into y will be greater than 0. So this is a uh, short way of saying that we are choosing x and y in -1 to 1 so that the sign of x and sign of y remain the same. This is the only part which is left out to show, to check the injectivity of f. So assume that you have chosen any two xy's so that the sign of xy is positive. That is, the sign of x and the sign of y are the same. And assume that fx is equal to fy. So that means that x divided by 1 minus x squared should be equal to y divided by 1 minus y squared. So if you just do a multiplication of this equality by 1 minus x squared into 1 minus y squared, you get x minus xy squared equal to y minus yx squared. Just to notice what you're doing here. So you get a y minus yx squared here and x minus xy squared here. Sorry. And uh, this equality, if you just take all the terms on the left hand side, that is, if you subtract it by y minus yx squared on both sides, then you will get an x minus y here first of all, and then you will get a yx squared minus xy squared. So if you take a xy common from that, then you will again get x minus y. So you get that this factorization would be x minus y into 1 plus xy. I hope it is clear. You get an x minus y, and you also get a x square y minus xy square. So you have taken xy common, so that is xy times x minus y, so you get this factorization. Now this factorization, this product of two real numbers is equal to 0. So therefore, at least one of the real numbers in this product has to be equal to 0, since the product is 0. Now 1 plus xy is not 0. In fact, 1 plus xy is a positive number because xy is greater than 0. Therefore, x has to be equal to y. That is, x minus y has to be 0. So x equal to y. So what have you proved? That if fx is equal to fy, then x has to be equal to y. So that implies that if x is not equal to y, then fx cannot be equal to fy. So you have proved that your mapping f is an injective mapping. Now you want to show that it is surjective. So first of all, notice that if you look at 0, the inverse image of 0 is 0. So the pre-image of 0 is non-empty. And in fact, by injectivity, this implies that uh, if you have the pre-image of any element non-empty, then it has to be a singleton because the map is injective. So we will try to see whether the pre-image of every point in R is non-empty or not. So let me just make a slight detour and digress a little and tell you why I'm calling it a point. See, in the last lecture, I think, or a few lectures back, I had just explained why the way the numbers in R and the points on a straight line are in 1-1 correspondence. So that is why that particular straight line is called a real line. And what we do is that real numbers, we, since they are in 1-1 correspondence with points, we sometimes call real numbers as points. So we will keep this in mind, and I will be doing this quite often. So let us get back to the proof now. Suppose I take any non-zero real number. Again, I want to see whether the pre-image of y is non-empty or not. So what am I trying to do? First of all, I want to find an x, so that fx is equal to y means I have to write down the formula for fx, which is x divided by 1 minus x squared, and I want it to be equal to y. So I do some calculation. I multiply by 1 minus x squared on both sides, and then I take all the terms on the left hand side. So what am I getting? I'm getting yx squared, because this minus yx squared going on the left side will become positive. Yx squared plus x minus y from here. This will be equal to 0. So this is a quadratic equation in x. Notice you want to find x. So we would like to solve this quadratic equation. So we know by Sridhar Acharya's method that x has a particular expression. So if your quadratic equation was ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0, then x would have the values minus b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac by 2a. Right? So in this particular equation, your b is minus 1. So you get a minus 1 plus or minus square root of b squared. So that becomes 1 minus 4ac. But ac here is minus y squared. So minus of 4ac means plus 4y squared. So you get minus 1 plus or minus square root of 1 plus 4y squared in the numerator, divided by 2 times the 2a. So the denominator is 2y. Okay. So x will take these two values, and these two values are real because you are looking at the square root of a positive number. Now, this is not sufficient for your proof, because what you have justified is that you will get two real numbers which will map to y if you want this equation to be true. But what you have to show that is these of these two real numbers, one will belong to the domain. The domain was open interval minus 1 to 1. So x has to belong to this open interval minus 1 to 1. So to check this, we will do it in two cases. One when y is positive and the other when y is negative. So first of all, if you take y to be positive, you notice that 1 plus 4y squared is greater than 1 is in any case true for any y. But now 1 plus 4y squared is going to be strictly less than 1 plus 4y squared plus 4y, because 4y is a positive real number. Okay, now what is 1 plus 4y squared plus 4y? It is just 1 plus 2y whole squared. So if you take the positive square root of each of these numbers, then you will still get this inequality, that 1 is less than square root of 1 plus 4y squared is less than the positive square root of 1 plus 2y whole squared. Since y is positive, 1 plus 2y is a positive number. So the positive square root will be exactly 1 plus 2y. Now, why does the inequality not change? Is because we have already seen that if y, say a and b are any two real numbers, then a less than b would imply that a squared is less than b squared, provided a and b are positive. All right, so how do you see that? If a is less than b, then just multiply by a on both sides. A is positive, suppose. So then a squared will be less than ab, and ab is going to be less than b squared, because again a is less than b, and you are multiplying by b, a less than b. If you multiply by b, then you will get ab is less than b squared, because b is also positive. So if you have two positive numbers a and b, then a less than b implies a squared less than b squared. Now if you go the other way around, suppose a squared is less than b squared, and you are looking at the positive square root. So you are trying to find out what is the relation between a and b, where a and b are positive, and you are given that a squared is less than b squared. Then the relation between a and b can be either of a less than b, or a equal to b, or a greater than b. But if a is less than b, then a squared has, sorry, if a is equal to b, then a squared has to be equal to b squared. And if a is greater than b, then a squared has to be greater than b squared. So uh, if you are given in hand already that a squared is less than b squared, then a will have to be less than b, where you are assuming that a and b are positive. So that is why we are able to say that if we have three numbers like this, one less than other and then the other less than the other one, then if you look at the positive square roots, the inequality will not change. Please keep that in mind. Okay, so now we want to see uh, just estimate this number as to where it belongs. We just add a minus 1 first of all to this inequality. What do we get? 0 less than minus 1 plus square root of 1 plus 4y squared is less than 2y. And then you divide this whole inequality by 2y. Since y is positive, 2y is also positive. So the inequality will not change, and you will get 0 less than minus 1 plus square root of 1 plus 4y squared by 2y less than 1. So what have you got? You have got that this number minus 1 plus square root of 1 plus 4y squared divided by 2y, this number is in the open interval 0 to 1. So it is in the domain of the definition of f. So you have been able to find a real number in the domain of f, so that f of this is equal to y. Fine. So that means if y is positive, its pre-image is non-empty under F. If y is negative, similar argument will give you that its pre-image will also be non-empty. So let us see what is the argument. First of all, again 1 plus 4y squared is greater than 1. No problems with that. Now your 4y is a negative number. So minus 4y is a positive number. Therefore, 1 plus 4y squared minus 4y is going to be strictly greater than 1 plus 4y squared. So again you take the positive square root. Then your inequality will not change and you will get 1 less than square root of 1 plus 4y squared less than what? So this is what? This is 1 minus 2y whole square, and 1 minus 2y is now a positive number because y is negative. So if you take the square root of 1 minus 2y whole square, a positive square root of 1 minus 2y whole squared, you will get 1 minus 2y. So this is the inequality you get when you take the positive square root of these numbers. Now to reach the particular solution which we got from Sridhar Rajacharya's method, I subtract with minus 1 subtract minus 1 from this inequality. So you are left with 0 less than minus 1 plus square root of 1 plus 4y squared less than minus 2y. Now what you do is you divide by 2y. Since y is negative, 2y is negative. So when you divide by 2y, what will happen is that the inequality will change. So when you are dividing by 2y, you get a minus 1 which now becomes smaller than minus 1 plus square root of 1 plus 4y squared divided by 2y, and that becomes less than 0, right? So this number minus 1 plus square root of 1 plus 4y squared by 2y, this is a number between minus 1 and 0, and hence it is in the domain open interval minus 1 to 1. So again you have got something in the domain, f of that is equal to y. So pre-image of y is non-empty even if y is less than 0. So you have seen the three cases, 0, greater than 0 and less than 0. In all the three cases, eh, for a real number, its pre-image under f is non-empty, so f is a surjective map. You have already seen that it is a injective map, so f becomes a bijective map, which proves that R is equipotent with minus 1, 1 open interval. In fact, I have just made an observation that this also could have worked as a proof. That is, if you assume that your open interval minus 1 to 1 is uh, uncountable, and then you show that there is this bijective map, so that would automatically imply that R is uncountable. But for us, it is other conclusion that this also proves that R is equipotent with open interval minus 1 to 1, which is interesting because we have the way we have developed our course, we have already proved that R is uncountable. We want to show that these two uncountable sets are equipotent because we have not discussed whether all uncountable sets would be equipotent or not. As I said, we will see that it is not true. Okay. So the next result is a simple exercise actually, and it is reminiscent of what we had done earlier, that if you take the set of positive integers, then the Cartesian product of it with itself, n cross n, is countable. So now to generalize that, what we do is we take any two arbitrary non-empty sets A and B which are countable. So they may be finite or countably infinite, we don't care. Then its Cartesian product A cross B will also be countable. Okay. So how are you going to prove that? First of all, since A and B are non-empty countable sets, we will be able to get surjective mappings from the set of positive integer to A and B. So I have called them little f and little g. So little f from n to A is surjective and little g from n to B is surjective. Using these two mappings, we will define a new mapping from n cross n to A cross B. And how is that? Just plain and simple. H of Nm is equal to Fn comma Gm. So our claim is that this H is also going to be surjective. And how are you going to prove that? The way you prove that a map is surjective. So take any element in A cross B. It would look like the pair x comma y, where x is in A, and some pair x comma y, where x is in A and y is in B. Now, since x belongs to A, you will be able to get a positive integer little n, say, so that Fn is equal to x. And similarly, since G is surjective, you will be able to get a positive integer little m, say, so that Gm is equal to y. So therefore, you are able to get a pair of positive integers n comma m, so that Fn comma Gm is actually equal to x comma y. So that means that the pre-image of x comma y under the map H will be non-empty, and hence H would be a surjective mapping. Now, you have already seen that n cross n is a countably infinite set. So by our characterization again, there is a surjective mapping from the set of positive integers to n cross n. So let us call it something phi. Then look at the composition H compose phi. So it goes from n to n cross n, and then from n cross n to A cross B. So H compose phi is a mapping from n to A cross B. H is surjective and phi is surjective. So composition of two surjective mappings is surjective. So you are able to get a surjective mapping from N to A cross B, which again gives you the characterization that A cross B is a countable set. So this gives you a very straightforward proof, straightforward in the sense that you are just going on using whatever knowledge you have in hand and logically proceeding to prove the result, that if A and B are non-empty countable sets, then the Cartesian product A cross B is also going to be countable. Okay. The next result is interesting, uh, and it is not something which you have already seen. It says that if you have any infinite set, so an infinite set can be of two types. It can be either countable or uncountable. So whatever your infinite set be, it will have a countably infinite subset. So the proof of this is reminiscent of a proof which we have already done. So let us see how we are going to proceed. What we do is, the basic idea is that we will try to get an injective mapping of the set of positive integers into S. Then since I get an injective mapping, the image of that mapping is going to be a countably infinite subset of S. So let us start. First you assume that, call that set something. So take any infinite set and suppose that is capital S. Now we want to define this mapping little h from N to S. So this we will do by induction. How? First, what you do is choose any arbitrary element of capital S, call that x1 say, and define h1 equal to x1. Then what you do is, in the next step, you just look at the complement of the singleton x1 in S. That is, look at the set S minus x1. Then S minus x1 is again going to be an infinite set. So you choose an arbitrary element x2 in S minus x1 and define h2 to be equal to x2. So this is your method of proceeding. So precisely speaking, what we say is that suppose we have chosen hk for k equal to 1 to n, and the notation is that hk is equal to xk, suppose. Then how have you chosen this? You are assuming that hk is in the complement of the set h1 h2 hk minus 1 in S. So hk should belong to S minus this set. Now, as I said in the case of 2. Similarly, once you have got, say, for example, H2, then what you are going to do is you are going to leave out H1 and H2 from the set S, that is, you look at the complement of H1, H2 in S, then that will again be an infinite set, and you choose any random element in that, call it X3, and define H3 is equal to X3. So that is our induction step. So suppose we have done till n. So how do we define the n plus 1th, the image of the n plus 1th, n plus 1 in positive integer is the following, that h1, h2, hn is a finite set. So again, if you leave out these n elements from the set, that is, you look at S minus H1, H2, Hn, then it will again be non-empty. So choose a random element xn plus 1 in this set S minus H1 to Hn, and you define Hn plus 1 is equal to xn plus 1. So this is your inductive step. So this tells you how you define H for any positive integer MC. Okay. So suppose you have got this map, then our claim is that this map is bound to be an injective map. So how do you check that? You take any two positive integers m and n which are different, not equal. So since they are not equal, one will be less than the other. Assume that m is less than n without loss of generality. Then what do you know about h of n? H of n is going to be an element, is an element by the definition of S minus H1, H2, etc. Hn minus 1. So you leave out the first H1, H2, Hn minus 1, these n minus 1 elements from the set S, and whatever is left out, you have chosen Hn to be from that. And what is Hm? Hm is going to belong to H1, H2, etc. Hn minus 1, because m is less than n. So h of m is in this set and h of n is outside this set in capital S. So naturally, hm and hn cannot be equal. Therefore, what you have shown is that H is an injective mapping. So as I said, that you have this injective mapping n from S. So if you look at the image of H and restrict your range to image of H, then H is a bijective mapping from N to the image of H. That means image of H is going to be a countably infinite set. So you have got a countable image of H is what? It is a subset of S. So you have got a countably infinite subset of S. Nice. Next result is also very, first of all, interesting, and secondly, very important. What it says is that if you look at the collection of all bounded open intervals in R, bounded open intervals in R are very significant, which we will learn in the next lecture, because they describe what is meant by, quote, nearness of points, unquote, uh, precisely in the set of real numbers. So these are important subsets, bounded open intervals, and of these bounded open intervals, so bounded open intervals, recall that that is an open interval of the type a comma b, where a and b are real numbers. So if you just restrict your attention to the collection of all bounded open intervals for which these endpoints a and b are rational numbers, then that collection is actually going to be a countable collection. This is what you want to prove. So that collection, we give it a name. So that name is a fancy U, like this, script U. So this script U means the collection of all bounded open intervals whose endpoints are rational numbers. Very good. Now we know that rational numbers are countably infinite. So that enables us to give an enumeration of Q. So what is the meaning of enumeration? It means that since Q is countably infinite, it is possible to get a bijective mapping from N to Q. So suppose that bijective mapping is F. There are several choices for this F, and suppose we write F of n equal to xn for every positive integer n. Then what do you have? You have that you get these numbers x1, x2, x3, etc., and they will comprise all the rational numbers. This is what is called an enumeration. So enumeration basically means choosing a bijective mapping from the set of positive integers to q, and giving a notation like this, that f of n is equal to xn. So 1 maps to x1, 2 maps to x2, 3 maps to x3, and so on. So this is called an enumeration of Q. All right. And kindly note that this doesn't mean anything like x1 is less than x2 less than x3 or anything like that. Because you know that between any two rational numbers, there are infinitely many rational numbers. So there is just simply no possibility of listing the first rational number and then writing down the second rational number and so on. It is not possible. So what you are just doing is that you are choosing a listing of the set of rational numbers. That is called enumeration. You're just choosing that x1 will mean the first rational number. That first doesn't relate to the order relation at all, and that 2 x2 will be just the image of 2, so this is the second rational number, x3 is the third rational number, and so on. So this gives you an enumeration. Using this enumeration, you define, so there is a typo here, that I've written aj and here I've written n, so this n should be actually j. So for every positive integer j, you define aj to be the set of all bounded open intervals whose endpoints are rational numbers, so that the left endpoint is fixed to be xj. So right endpoint has to be some xr, because I have chosen an enumeration, and xr naturally has to be greater than xj. So aj is the collection of all bounded open intervals in R whose endpoints are rational numbers, and also whose endpoint is left endpoint is fixed to be xj. Okay. So then if you look at all these aj's, a1, a2, a3, etc., then you notice that you are actually getting the collection of all bounded open intervals in R whose endpoints are rational numbers. Because if the endpoints are rational numbers, then the left endpoint has to be one of the x1, x2, x3, etc. So it has to belong to one of the AJs. Therefore, U is equal to A1 union A2 union A3 union A4, etc. So this etc., this infinite union is expressed in short form like this. You just use a big union sign, and then you say that you are looking at the union of the AJs, where J is ranging over the set of natural numbers. So we write it as J equal to 1 to infinity. So here this is just a symbol which just means that you look at all the AJs where J is ranging over the set of natural numbers and take the union of all such AJs. That is the meaning of this particular notation. And this is equal to this is clear now. Now you notice what is your AJ. AJ is the collection of these type of open intervals. So these open intervals are completely determined by the right end point, because the left end point is fixed. It has to be xj. So if you look at the right end points, that is if you look at all xr such that xr is a rational number greater than xj, then this is equipotent with AJ. That is, AJ is completely determined by BJ and BJ is completely determined by AJ. Because if you take any element of AJ, eh, all the curious place is that what is its right endpoint, and that you are listing here. So there is a bijection from AJ to BJ, very easily described. Just look at open interval xj to xr and you send it to xr. So AJ and BJ are equipotent, very good. And BJ is a subset of rational numbers, right? So rational numbers are countable. Subset of a countable set is countable, so BJ is countable. Since BJ and AJ are equipotent, so again AJ is countable because equipotent sets are either both countable or both uncountable. So AJ is countable. Therefore, each AJ is countable, and this is a script U is a countable union of countable sets. So script U is also countable. So what have you proved? You have proved that if you look at the collection of all bounded open intervals in R whose endpoints are rational numbers, then it is countable. The collection is countable. You will have only countably many bounded open intervals whose endpoints are rational numbers. Very good. So the next thing which I want to discuss in this lecture and is something which is which requires a new concept, which is the power set of any set. So what is the definition of that? Take any set capital A. If look at the set of all subsets of A, then that set is called the power set of A. And our notation for that is this script P bracket A. Uh, More or less in all the books that actually in all the books I have seen, this has been used as the notation for power set, and it seems it is more or less standard. So let us look at some examples. I have just taken A to be the empty set. Then what will be the power set of empty set? If you it has empty set has only one subset, that is itself. So the power set of empty set will be a singleton containing the empty set. So notice the power set of empty set is not empty, it is a singleton which contains empty set. Similarly, if you look at the power set of the singleton set 1, then what are the subsets of 1? We have to list that. The one is the empty set, the other one is the whole set itself. So the power set of 1 will contain two elements. So power set of empty set contains 2 to the power 0 elements. Power set of a singleton contains 2 to the power 1 elements. Next, you look at the set 1, 2, for example. Let us do two more, then we'll get the pattern. So if you look at the set containing two elements 1 and 2, then what are its subsets? There is one set subset which has no elements, that is the empty set. There are two subsets which will contain exactly one element of the set 1, 2, right? Because there are two elements here, so you will get precisely two singletons. And apart from that, you will get the whole set itself, which will contain both the elements. So total number of elements of the power set of 1, 2 is 2 square. So see, it was 2, 0, 2, 1, 2 squared. So the exponent which you are getting, the power you are getting, is the number of elements of the set. Similarly, if you look at this one more example, suppose you have the set 1, 2, 3, then what are its subsets? It will have one subset which will have no elements. How many singleton subsets? As many as there are elements here, because for every element of the set you will get a singleton, so there will be three such. How many subsets which will have two elements? You have to choose two elements from three elements, so there are three choose two ways, so that is exactly three ways. That is, you choose 1 and 2, then you choose 1 and 3, then you choose 2 and 3. So there are three ways you can choose two elements from three elements, and those three ways are going to tell you that there are going to be three subsets of 1, 2, 3 containing exactly two elements. And apart from that, there is only one more subset possible, which is the whole set itself. So how many have you got now? You have got 8 elements in the power set of 1, 2, 3, that is 2 to the power 3, right? So this is a general result which tells you that if you have a finite set containing n elements, then power set of A will be again a finite set containing 2 to the power n elements. So how do you determine that? The way I was talking about the previous examples, you take any set A, and suppose I want to find out how many sets are there containing k elements. So first of all, you look at, say, containing 0 elements. So there is only one subset of A which contains 0 elements, and that is the empty set. So that is equal to n choose 0. I think many of you are used to the notation n c k. So I'm not going to write that. I'm writing n choose k like this, and this precisely means the number of ways k things can be chosen from n things. So the number of ways nothing when 0 things can be chosen out of n things. Am I correct? Number of ways, let us say number of subsets of A which will have 0 elements is precisely n choose 0, and that is 1. Right, that is the empty set. And suppose I try to find out the number of subsets of A which contains 1 element each. So I have to choose one element from those n elements. So there will be n choose 1 ways. Similarly, if I want a all the subsets of A which contain 2 elements, so then I will have to choose 2 elements from the n elements of A. So the number of ways I can do that is n choose 2, and that is going to give you the number of subsets of A which contains 2 elements. So in general, if I want to find out how many subsets are there of capital A containing k elements, that will be equal to the number of ways you can choose k elements from n elements. So that is n choose k, and that is equal to what? N factorial divided by k factorial into n minus k factorial. Now, for those who don't remember what n factorial is, so n factorial is just 1 into 2 into 3 into etc. into n. So just multiply all the numbers from 1 to n. That is the expression for n factorial. Okay, so you know this. So how many elements will the power set of A contain? It will contain summation k is equal to 0 to n choose k elements, because the power set is the set of all subsets of A. So it will have subsets containing 0 elements of A, containing 1 element of A, 2 element of A, and so on till n elements of A. And how many of those for each uh, k? If you want to know the number of subsets of A containing k elements, that is precisely n choose k, we have said that. So you have to add all these numbers to get the total number of elements in the power set of A. Now I am using a result which is called the binomial theorem, which you have already seen, I think, in your high school, as well as I think in a previous course in your undergraduate level also, that if you take any two numbers A and B, then A plus B to the power n is given by this formula. N choose 0 b to the power n plus n choose 1 a b to the power n minus 1 plus n choose 2 a squared b to the power n minus 2 plus etc. plus n choose n a to the power n b to the power 0. So this whole summation is written in a short form like this: summation k is equal to 0 to n choose k, a to the power k, b to the power n minus k. So if you look at this formula and this number which we want to calculate how many are there, here if you put a is equal to 1 and b is equal to 1, that is what you get. So summation k is equal to 0 to n choose k is going to be equal to 1 plus 1 to the power n. So that means exactly 2 to the power n, right? So if you have a finite set containing n elements, then the power set of A will contain 2 to the power n elements. Very good. Now what we want to discuss is power set a little bit more, but before that, this is a simple exercise actually, that forget about the simple, this is an exercise that you have to show that the set S of all finite subsets of n. So just keep taking finite subsets of n, then that will be countable. This is what you want to show. So how are you going to do that? If we just give some nomenclature, let us denote the set 1, 2, etc. n by an for every n, and also denote the empty set by a0. Then if you take a finite subset of n, then there is necessarily some element of B which will be the maximum element. So suppose that maximum element is equal to n, then all the elements of B will be subset of an for some n in n union 0. So this 0 is important because if you take a finite subset of n, then B may be an empty set, in which case it is actually equal to a0. So it is a subset of a0. Okay. And because equal to two sets are equal if one is the subset of other and the other is also a subset of the first one. So in particular, if B is equal to A naught, then in particular B is a subset of A naught. There is no problem with that. Okay, but suppose B is non-empty. So let me just give you one example. Say suppose I take B to be equal to 10, 51, 57. All right. So B has three elements, 10, 51, 57. So what is the an for which B will be a subset of that? For to determine that, you just look at the maximum element of B. So I've forgotten what I had taken B to be. So it was I think 21, 51, 57, something like that. So 57 is the maximum element of B. So if you look at A57, that is all positive integers till 57. So it will contain 21 also, it will contain 51 also, and it will also contain 57. So B will be a subset of A57. So how are you determining this n for a non-empty B? You are just looking at the maximum element of B, and if that is little n, then B will automatically be a subset of an. Okay, so since B is a subset of an, B is an element of power set of an. Okay, so what does that mean? That if you look at any B finite subset of n, means take any B belonging to S, then B has to be an element of power set of an for some n. So therefore, B will belong to the union of all such power sets. Again, I am using the same type of notation. This means you are taking the union of power set of A0, power set of A1, power set of A2, etc. A power set of An, where n is ranging over the set of all natural numbers and 0. So that we denote like this. Infinity again here is only a symbol. So we just denote it like that. And what we have proved here is that if I take any element of S, then it will be an element of one of the power set of An. So it will be the element of the union. Now, what can you say about power set of An? Power set of An is finite. We have already seen. So it is a countable set. And the union which we are taking is over the set n union 0. So this n union 0 is a countably infinite set because it is countable union of two countable sets. So what have you gotten on this side is a countable union of countable sets. So this union is a countable set and S is a subset of the countable set. So S is automatically countable. This is what you have proved, that the set S of all finite subsets of n is countable. Okay. Next result is what we want to prove for basically the set of positive integers. So instead of that, we prove it for any arbitrary set. What is the result? That a set is not equipotent with its power set. Okay, so there will not be a bijective mapping from a set capital A to the set power set of capital A. So first we have discussed the case when capital A is empty. So if you look at the empty set, power set of empty set is a singleton. We saw this. It is the set containing the empty set. So empty set cannot be equipotent with power set of empty set. Empty set can be equipotent only with itself. So since power set of empty set is not empty, so they are not equipotent. Fine. Now suppose A is any non-empty set. Then I want to say that it cannot be equipotent. So there is no possibility of getting a bijective mapping. This is what we want to show. So we assume to the contrary that it is, suppose it is possible to get, we are not bothering about bijective also, we take relax the condition a little bit. We say that suppose if possible there is a surjective mapping, and we'll show that this is a contradiction. So there is no question of getting a surjective mapping from A to PA. So there is no question of getting a bijective mapping from A to PA. So that is what we are trying to show, and the argument which we give was given by Cantor, and it is called the generalized form of Cantor's diagonal argument. So what is this? How does this argument proceed? That suppose if possible there is a surjective mapping from A to PA, then you construct a set which consists of those elements of A for which A does not belong to FA. What is FA? FA is a element of the power set of A. That means FA is a subset of A. So this requirement makes sense. For every little a in A, look at FA, which is a subset of A, then see whether A is a element of FA or not. If it is not an element of FA, then uh, it will belong to this collection. That is the defining property of this collection. So capital B is precisely the set of all elements of A for which A does not belong to FA. So B is a subset of A. It may be empty, we don't care. So since B is a subset of A, B is an element of power set of A, and F is a surjective mapping. So pre-image of B under the map F should not be empty. So I should be able to get, and I will get an element of capital A, which we have denoted by A0, so that F of A0 is equal to B. Okay. So I will get such an A0. Now A0 is what? A0 is an element of capital A. So, and capital B is a set. So we must be, and that is a subset of A. So A is behaving like a universal set here. So A0, this element of capital A, will either belong to B or it will not belong to B. Because for every set, the well-definedness tells you that given any element in the universal set, you should be able to tell whether it belongs to the set or it does not belong to the set. So either of these two is true. Now let us look at it closely. Suppose that A0 belongs to B. Then A0 has to satisfy this property because it belongs to B. So A0 cannot belong to FA0. But what was FA0? FA0 was B. So if A0 belongs to B, then A0 cannot belong to B, right? What about the other one? If A0 does not belong to B, then this defining condition of B will not hold for A0 because it does not belong to B. So that means A0 will have to belong to FA0. But if what is FA0? FA0 is just B. So that means A0 will have to belong to B. So what have you shown? You have shown that if A0 belongs to B, then A0 cannot belong to B. And if A0 does not belong to B, then A0 has to belong to B. So in both the cases, what you're getting is a contradiction, right? It's obvious, I think, now. So this contradiction arose from the fact that we assume that there is a surjective map like this. So that is a false statement. That means that you can never get a surjective mapping from A to the power set of A. So in particular, A, capital A cannot be equipotent with its power set. This is extraordinary. We already saw this for finite sets. There A had n, if A had n elements, non-empty finite set, then power set of A has 2 to the power n elements. So there is no possibility of getting a surjective mapping from a set containing n elements to a set containing 2 to the power n elements, which is more than n, right? Obviously. Okay. So what are the conclusions from this result? First of all, the n is not equipotent with power set of n. So that means what? That power set of n cannot be countable. So power set of n is uncountable. This is a theorem which we will not prove. It says that power set of n is equipotent with R. So it is interesting, but we will not prove it because it requires some arguments which are beyond our understanding right now. It can be done later on. Okay. So power set of n is equipotent with R. It can be shown. But what is more interesting also, I don't want to say more interesting, what is also interesting is that this was for any arbitrary set, right? So instead of the set capital A, if you look at R, then R will not be equipotent with PR, power set of R. So R is an uncountable set. Power set of R is also uncountable. Why is it uncountable? Because it at least contains all the singletons, singleton x, where x belongs to R. So look at the collection of all singletons in the power set of R. That set, the set of all singletons, is going to be equipotent with R, because just take any real number x, send it to the singleton containing x. So that gives you a bijective mapping from R to the collection of all singleton sets, singleton subsets of R. So therefore, uh, if you look at the singleton subsets of R, that forms a collection which is uncountable because it is equipotent with R. So therefore, PR is also uncountable. So the power set of R is uncountable, R is also uncountable, but now they are not equipotent. So as I said before, that there is no such blanket thing that if if the sets are uncountable, then they are all of the same type. It is not true. So we are not going to discuss those things in our lecture. What it leads to further in this particular topic is the notion of cardinal numbers and ordinal numbers, and a very interesting hypothesis called the continuum hypothesis. So those things are beyond our course for the time being, so we don't discuss them. And what I want to stress is that whatever we have learned about countable and uncountable sets is going to be useful in our understanding of real analysis for the time being. But what we have also shown is that you can proceed further in this direction instead of going into the other parts of real analysis and get several interesting things. So this is a subject in itself, of which we have just uh, so this is an iceberg of which we have just seen the tip. That is what I wish to say. So let us stop here.